What happens when the perfect marriage turns out to be the perfect lie? What happens when the person sleeping next to you, the one who kisses you goodnight, who swears they love you more than life itself, is secretly plotting your death? In the heart of Orlando, Florida, behind the high walls of a well-kept historic mansion, a man named Shanti Cooper Trance lost his life in the most chilling and unthinkable way. He wasn't just murdered. He was deceived, betrayed, and silenced by the one person he trusted the most, his wife, David Trance. Yes, you heard that right, David. On paper, David Trance was the picture-perfect husband. Affluent, charming, deeply obsessed with home renovations, and obsessed, perhaps dangerously so, with appearances. But behind the neatly painted walls and open-house smiles was a marriage built not on love or loyalty, but secrets, resentment, and lies. The kind of lies that can only end one way, in blood. On the morning of April 24, 2018, David called 911 in a panic, claiming he'd found his wife, Shanti, dead in the bathtub. He sounded distraught. Grief-stricken. Shocked. But there was just one problem. It was all an act. From the moment detectives stepped into that house, nothing felt right. Not the body. Not the scene. And especially not David. And as investigators dug deeper, what they uncovered was more twisted than anyone could have imagined. A troubled marriage. A web of manipulation. A man with a taste for fantasy, and a disturbing obsession with TV shows about murder and real estate. A man who believed he could fake his way through grief and fool everyone around him, but instead walked himself straight into a murder charge. This is not just a story about murder. It's a story about control. About manipulation. About the horrifying mask someone can wear while playing the role of the grieving spouse. And most chilling of all, David Trance was no killer in a moment of passion. This was planned. Cold. Calculated. And in the aftermath, instead of remorse, he gave a performance, one worthy of an Oscar. If only the cops had been movie critics. This is the disturbing true story of how an evil spouse thought he could act his way out of murder. But the truth? It always leaves a stain. To understand the twisted puzzle of this murder, we must first rewind the clock. Back to when David Trance and Shanti Cooper's lives first crossed paths. At first glance, they couldn't have seemed more different. David Trance was a 48-year-old man with a quiet demeanor, the kind who didn't like too much attention. Soft-spoken, polite, but emotionally detached. He had a comfortable amount of wealth, thanks to a family inheritance and some shrewd real estate investments. But money wasn't just money to David, it was security. Control. Image. And his obsession with maintaining a perfect life bordered on compulsive. He lived in a 4,000-square-foot house in the Delaney Park neighborhood of Orlando, Florida, an area steeped in old charm and southern prestige. But despite his wealth, David didn't live in luxury. The house was falling apart. Every dollar he earned or inherited went into renovating the property, which he treated like a full-time project. It wasn't just home improvement. It was a full-blown obsession. David had another obsession, too, reality TV. Specifically, shows about home renovation and, more disturbingly, crime. The kind where couples fix up houses during the day, and betray each other by night. He watched those shows religiously. Took notes. Memorized episodes. That's where the irony begins. Because David Trance would eventually try to combine both worlds, fix up a house, and cover up a murder. But we're not there yet. In 2013, David met Shanti Cooper through an online dating site. Shanti, a vibrant and educated woman in her 30s, had a young son from a previous relationship. She was smart, ambitious, and passionate about helping others. A professional businesswoman with a warm smile and a big heart. Those who knew her said she had a fiery spirit, unafraid to speak her mind, deeply protective of her son, and unwilling to settle for anything less than love and respect. She thought she had found both in David. But right from the beginning, there were cracks. David was distant. Cold. Emotionally unavailable. Shanti chalked it up to shyness at first. She was a believer in second chances, in patience. She tried to understand him. Tried to love him. Tried to believe he could become the husband she and her son needed. They eventually got married in a quiet ceremony. No big wedding. No extravagant honeymoon. Just a promise to build a life together, and a fixer-upper house that David insisted would be their dream home. Only it never happened. David spent years working on that house, ripping out walls, digging up floors, bringing in contractors. And spending an estimated $250,000 in renovations. And yet, there was no kitchen. No finished bathrooms. The house was unlivable. So much so that Shanti and her son were forced to live in a one-bedroom apartment above the garage while David stayed inside the gutted shell of a house like a hermit obsessed with his vision. And slowly, the charm wore off. Shanti started to see the truth. David wasn't building a home. He was building a prison. He rarely worked a regular job. He was emotionally unavailable. And worse, he refused to share any financial information. Shanti, who had always been fiercely independent, started to feel trapped. They argued. Frequently. She wanted stability, a real home, a partner. He wanted control, silence, and a fantasy life that existed only in his mind. And then came the secrets. David never let Shanti into his world. He kept her at arm's length, both emotionally and financially. He had no interest in physical intimacy. No real connection. He was married on paper, but detached in every other way. Shanti became suspicious. She even started confiding in friends that David might be hiding something dark. Some said she wondered if he was gay. Others said she thought he might be mentally unstable. But here's the thing, Shanti was not a victim who stayed silent. She was ready to take action. She began meeting with divorce attorneys. She made financial plans. She was preparing to leave. And that's when everything started accelerating. David became more withdrawn. Paranoid. He knew she was slipping away, and with her, the lifestyle he'd grown used to. But David didn't beg. He didn't cry. He didn't even try to change. Instead, he plotted. Because David Trance believed one thing deeply, if he couldn't have the life he wanted, he would construct it. Even if that meant destroying everything in it. April 24, 2018. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning, or it should have been. But inside the Trance family home in Orlando, Florida, something was deeply wrong. David Trance was frantic as he called 911. His wife, Shanti Cooper Trance, wasn't breathing. The life had been drained from her. The paramedics and officers rushed to the scene, but the damage had already been done. Shanti's lifeless body was found in the bedroom, bloodied, cold, and still. At first glance, it looked like a tragedy, but there were immediate red flags. Shanti had been violent, known to lash out when provoked. David, on the other hand, was timid, reserved, and often the target of her rage. As the investigation began, the picture of their marriage was far from the idyllic union they tried to portray. For months, David had been suspicious of Shanti's behavior. He had caught her in lies. There were whispers of infidelity, and he had recently confronted her about missing money from their joint accounts. But Shanti wasn't one to take responsibility. She was a master at turning the tables, playing the victim, always manipulating everyone around her. The night before her death, she had gotten into a violent confrontation with David, accusing him of things she had done herself. She screamed at him. She threatened him. She called him worthless, and then she pushed him to the edge, knowing exactly how to provoke him. But the question remained, did Shanti's aggressive behavior finally push David to the breaking point? Or was this part of her grand manipulation scheme? As detectives combed through the house, they discovered disturbing evidence. Her wounds, though brutal, didn't fit the narrative of a woman fighting for her life. Instead, they looked like the aftermath of an attack she may have staged to make it look like David was the abuser. But the deeper they dug, the clearer it became, Shanti wasn't the innocent victim she wanted everyone to believe. She had been playing a dangerous game. Financial records revealed that Shanti had drained thousands of dollars from David's accounts. She had lied about her career and was secretly living a life of luxury at her husband's expense. Affairs, lies, and manipulation, these were just a few of the tricks Shanti used to control David. Her violent outbursts were a regular occurrence, but no one had ever seen her true nature. The public face of the sweet, loving wife was just that, a facade. Behind closed doors, she had turned their marriage into a toxic prison. As the police reviewed her past, they found a pattern. Shanti had manipulated every situation to suit her needs, and now, she was trying to manipulate her way out of a murder charge. She had staged her own death, almost. She had tried to control the narrative, making it seem as though David was the aggressor, the monster. But the evidence didn't lie. Forensic evidence showed that Shanti had injuries that were inconsistent with her claims. Her blood was found in places that didn't make sense, given her story. It became evident that she had been the one to provoke the fight and that her wounds were self-inflicted, likely to make it appear as though she had been the victim of a violent attack. Yet, Shanti wasn't finished with her act. She continued to play the role of the helpless wife. And even as she lay dead, the deception didn't stop. Her manipulative ways were ingrained in everything she did. And as David struggled to explain himself, the investigators grew more and more suspicious. Was this woman's death truly an accident, or had Shanti orchestrated it all? Had she set David up for a crime he didn't commit, all to protect herself? After the crime scene had been thoroughly processed, and the evidence was in, it didn't take long for the authorities to make their move. The picture was becoming clearer. Shanti Cooper-Trance, the woman who had so carefully crafted the image of an innocent wife, was now at the center of a murder investigation. The stage was set for a legal battle that would capture the attention of the public, and the truth, no matter how shocking, was about to be exposed. It wasn't long before detectives had enough evidence to make an arrest. The forensic findings, the financial records, and the shocking pattern of lies Shanti had weaved over the years painted a damning portrait of her actions. The arrest was swift. Shanti was taken into custody under suspicion of first-degree murder. Her cold demeanor during the arrest contrasted sharply with the portrayal of the fragile woman she had tried so hard to convince the world she was. As she was led away in handcuffs, a chill went down the spine of everyone who had followed the case. This wasn't the act of a terrified wife. This was the final reveal of a master manipulator, one who had been playing a game all along. The charges were serious: first-degree murder, conspiracy, and attempted manslaughter. The case against her was being built on more than just circumstantial evidence. The lies she had spun in her marriage, her financial scheming, and the forensic evidence that contradicted her initial claims all pointed in one direction: Shanti Cooper-Trance was a murderer. But even as the gravity of the charges sank in, Shanti wasn't going down without a fight. Her defense attorneys quickly went to work, preparing a strategy that would attempt to save her from the mounting evidence against her. The public, still reeling from the shocking nature of the crime, began to split into two camps. One side saw Shanti as a woman who had been driven to madness by her husband's cruelty. The other, led by the growing body of evidence, saw her as a woman who had carefully manipulated those around her for years. The media, ever hungry for drama, found themselves caught in the center of the spectacle, with every move and every piece of evidence becoming front-page news. As Shanti was arraigned in court, the courtroom was packed with spectators eager to witness the next chapter in the unfolding drama. Her defense was nothing short of an act of manipulation in itself. The strategy was clear: they would paint David Trance as the true villain, the abusive husband who had pushed Shanti to the brink. The defense argued that Shanti had been a victim for years, subjected to her husband's cruelty. They presented their case in dramatic terms, describing how she had endured emotional and physical abuse. But the prosecution was ready to strike back. The state's case was built on the facts that could not be ignored. They argued that Shanti was not a victim but a predator. The prosecution tore into her character, revealing her history of manipulation and deceit. They pointed out that the financial records were clear. Shanti had drained David's accounts for years. They also brought forward the forensic evidence that showed the inconsistencies in her initial account of the crime. The public was torn. Some believed the defense's argument, painting Shanti as a woman pushed to her breaking point. Others, however, were disgusted by the evidence that painted her as a cold-hearted murderer, one who had orchestrated her husband's downfall to cover up her own guilt. Media outlets amplified the drama, with each new revelation stoking the fire of public opinion. The case wasn't just about the truth, it had become a circus of sensationalized headlines, with each side fighting not just for justice, but for their narrative to dominate the airwaves. The spotlight on Shanti was now blinding. And in the midst of all the attention, a shocking new twist was revealed. The defense had presented one key piece of evidence that would shake the very foundation of the case, a supposed confession from David Trance, made during a private conversation with Shanti. The defense claimed that David had admitted to being the one who had killed Shanti, though they could never present any real proof. The accusation seemed to come out of nowhere, but it was enough to stir doubt in the minds of some jurors and the public. The prosecution was quick to respond, dismantling the confession as nothing more than an attempt by Shanti to shift the blame. They pointed out the numerous inconsistencies and outright lies in Shanti's own testimony. It was clear that her claims of innocence were just another act, another desperate attempt to wriggle out of a crime she had orchestrated. But despite the damning evidence, the case was far from over. Shanti's lawyers fought tooth and nail to defend their client, bringing in expert witnesses who tried to argue that her actions had been the result of years of psychological trauma. They painted a picture of a woman who was trapped in a marriage she could not escape, a woman whose desperation led her to take drastic measures. The legal battle raged on. The media and public seemed to sway with every new twist, each side presenting their narrative with a degree of flair that made the case feel more like a high-profile drama than a straightforward murder trial. But in the end, the truth would prevail. And no matter how many false accusations or dramatic defenses Shanti and her team tried to throw into the ring, the evidence told a very different story. Shanti Cooper Trance was a woman who had spent years building a web of lies, manipulating everyone around her. Now, she would face the consequences for her actions. As the trial moved into its final stages, the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension. The world had been watching from the sidelines as Shanti Cooper Trance, the so-called evil wife, fought tooth and nail to escape the murder charge that hung over her head. This was the moment that would determine her fate, and the public was riveted by every word spoken in that room. The defense and prosecution had one final chance to present their cases, and they weren't about to go down without a fight. The courtroom was filled with spectators, journalists, and even true crime enthusiasts who had been following the case from the start. The defense had attempted every maneuver in the book, trying to shift the narrative in favor of their client. But now, the clock was ticking down. The defense called its final witnesses, psychologists who claimed that Shanti was a woman driven to the brink by years of mental abuse. They painted a picture of a fragile, emotionally broken woman who had acted in a moment of desperation, unable to think clearly when she took David's life. Their testimony, though dramatic, seemed to fall short in the face of overwhelming evidence. And then, in one of the most unexpected turns of the trial, the prosecution called upon an unlikely witness, one of Shanti's former friends. This person, whose testimony had been previously deemed inadmissible, now stood in the witness box. The friend revealed shocking details about Shanti's manipulative behavior long before David's death, how she had told them about her plans to get rid of her husband in the months leading up to the murder. The defense had tried to discredit the friend, but the testimony hit hard, sending ripples through the courtroom. The defense scrambled to reframe the narrative, but it was too late. The courtroom's attention was focused entirely on the truth that was emerging. Shanti had meticulously orchestrated David's murder, using both emotional manipulation and financial leverage to get what she wanted. The idea that Shanti was an innocent woman pushed too far began to crumble, piece by piece, as these new revelations hit home. As the defense struggled to counter these bombshell testimonies, the prosecution brought forward more damning evidence. A key piece was the cell phone records. Messages between Shanti and an unknown individual, discussing her plans to take care of the problem that David posed to her financial future. These texts weren't just vague comments, they were chilling in their specificity, detailing how Shanti intended to kill David and make it look like an accident. One of the most shocking pieces of evidence was a hidden surveillance camera that had been installed in the home by a private investigator. The footage showed Shanti, under the guise of a concerned wife, calmly moving around the house in the hours leading up to David's death. In the video, her demeanor was eerily calm, nothing like the emotional wreck she had portrayed during her initial interviews with police. This was not the face of a woman caught in a moment of passion or desperation. It was the face of a cold, calculating individual who had carefully planned every step of her crime. The defense tried to downplay the significance of the footage, but the damage was done. The jury, no longer swayed by Shanti's previous pleas of innocence, was now fully focused on the mountain of evidence against her. Throughout the trial, the tension between the two sides had been palpable. The defense's closing statement was filled with fiery rhetoric, attempting to paint Shanti as a victim of circumstance, a woman trapped in a loveless marriage. They argued that she was not the villain the prosecution had painted her to be, but rather a woman who had been pushed to her breaking point. Shanti, seated in the defense's seat, wiped away tears as her lawyer passionately argued for leniency. The defense team leaned heavily on the idea that Shanti was suffering from a mental breakdown and was not in her right mind when she killed David. They tried to humanize her, bringing up her past and the emotional toll the case had taken on her. But then the prosecution delivered its final blow, cutting through the defense's arguments with surgical precision. The prosecutor's voice rang out in the courtroom as they laid out the cold, hard facts once more, the motive, the means, and the clear evidence of Shanti's intent. This was no accident. This was premeditated murder. The prosecutor's closing argument was one for the books. They spoke of justice, of the need to hold Shanti accountable for the death of a man who had trusted her, loved her, and provided for her. There were no tears, no dramatic appeals, just a steady, unflinching demand for the truth to be heard and for justice to be served. As the jury deliberated, the tension in the courtroom reached a fever pitch. Time seemed to slow, each moment dragging on as everyone waited for the final decision. When the verdict was finally read aloud, the courtroom went silent. Shanti, her face twisted in a mask of apprehension, listened as the foreman of the jury announced the decision. We, the jury, find the defendant, Shanti Cooper-Trance, guilty of first-degree murder. A gasp echoed throughout the room. Shanti's eyes widened, her face drained of color. She had fought so hard to convince everyone that she was innocent, that the man she had murdered was the villain in this story. Now, her worst fears had come true. The judge quickly moved forward with sentencing. Shanti Cooper-Trance, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For a moment, there was no sound, only the distant hum of the air conditioning, as if the world outside had frozen. As the gavel fell and the courtroom began to clear, the reactions were mixed. David's family, who had been silently watching the trial unfold, finally allowed themselves to exhale. The justice they had been seeking for so long had finally been served. They knew that the pain would never truly go away, but at least they could now begin to heal, knowing that Shanti would never harm anyone else again. Shanti, for her part, was in disbelief. She had thought she could outsmart the system, that she could manipulate her way out of a murder charge. But in the end, the truth had won. As she was led away in handcuffs, there was no dramatic exit, no final act of defiance. There was only the quiet, cold acceptance of her fate. The public reacted as they always do, some expressing relief, while others, still trapped in the mystery of it all, began to question how someone so calculating had managed to slip through the cracks for so long. People discussed the case online, analyzed every word spoken in the courtroom, and wondered how they, too, could have been deceived. The trial was over. The verdict was in. But the echoes of Shanti's actions would reverberate for years to come. As we come to the end of this gripping tale, one truth remains clear: justice, no matter how delayed, will ultimately find its way. But while the case of Shanti Cooper-Trance may have concluded in the courtroom, there's still so much to uncover, so many stories to be told. Stories like this one, filled with deception, betrayal, and the battle for truth, deserve to be heard, shared, and understood. Now, before you scroll away and move on to the next video, ask yourself this: did this video keep you on the edge of your seat? Did you learn something you hadn't known before? If the answer is yes, then don't let this moment slip away without taking action. Your support is the reason we're able to bring these stories to light. If you want more chilling true crime cases, more courtroom drama, more deep dives into the minds of those who deceive, then you need to subscribe. Because the truth is, without your support, we can't keep doing this. Liking this video shows the algorithm that this story matters, and helps others just like you uncover the truth too. So take a moment. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and don't forget to share it with someone who needs to hear it. You don't want to miss what's coming next, and we don't want to miss out on having you as part of this incredible community. Make sure your voice is heard. Subscribe now.